What if I told you that civilization itself, everything from writing, farming, cities, to law, was built not just by brilliance, but by bondage? Yes, while history books celebrate the great kings of Egypt and the inventors of Mesopotamia, they often skip over the truth. The rise of civilization was soaked in sweat, silence, and slavery. This isn't just about shackles, it's about the system that normalized them. Now, let's embark on a journey that many history lessons skipped over. We're talking about slavery in ancient civilizations like Egypt, Greece, and Rome. Spoiler alert, it's going to get real dark. So hold on tight, because this is history unfiltered. Ancient Mesopotamia, nestled between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, gave us cities, agriculture, calendars, and yes, slavery. In ancient Sumer, around 3000 BCE, slavery wasn't a side effect of war. It was a legal, accepted institution. The enslaved were known as wardum, male, and amtum, female. Some were prisoners of war, others were debtors, and shockingly, some were even born into it as a social class. When King Hammurabi crafted his famous code around 1754 BCE, he made one thing clear: slaves were property, not people. If you injured a slave, the fine was far less than injuring a free man. A slave could be branded or mutilated if caught fleeing. Harboring a fugitive slave was a punishable crime. But here's the twist: despite being bound, some slaves could own property, marry, and even buy their freedom. In rare cases, a freed slave could rise in status. But most lived and died as invisible cogs in society's machine. Fun fact: some tablets found in the ruins of Nepal record sales of slaves the same way we delist goats or wine. Imagine your entire existence reduced to a name, an age, and a price on clay. Moving west, let's talk about ancient Egypt. Now, pop culture loves showing Egyptian slaves dragging massive stones to build tombs for kings. But historians now say the builders of the pyramids may have actually been paid workers with housing, medical care, and beer rations. So where's the slavery? Look deeper. By the time Egypt entered the New Kingdom period, 1550 to 1070 BCE, slavery was in full swing. Egyptians enslaved, prisoners from Nubia and Canaan, locals who couldn't pay debts, and criminals who were sentenced into bondage. They were put to work in temples, estates, farms, and even royal palaces. One chilling detail: slaves could be buried alive with their masters, especially if believed to serve them in the afterlife. Imagine spending your whole life in bondage, then being sealed into death beside your owner. Yet paradoxically, some slaves rose to prestige. Kemsit, a Nubian woman enslaved in the Egyptian court, became a royal concubine and was buried with honor. So yes, some slaves could gain status, but only through complete surrender to the will of power. So in ancient Egypt, slavery was not just a means of labor, it was a tool for control and power. It was a system deeply ingrained in society, affecting every level from the pharaoh's palace to the humblest village. Now, let's set sail across the Mediterranean to ancient Greece and Rome, where philosophers preached freedom while owning slaves. As Egyptian empires faded into scrolls of myth, the torch of civilization passed westward, to marble cities where thinkers carved democracy from stone, but chained reason's builders to the shadows behind the columns. Let's move into a world that praised reason, yet bound reason's builders in silence. Athens, the beacon of democracy, a city where men debated justice, invented logic, and voted on laws in open forums. But who polished the marble under their sandals? Who filled their amphorae, fed their philosophers, raised their children? Slaves, 1/3 of the population. In Athenian society, the mind was worshipped, but manual labor was despised. Thus, slavery became the spine of daily life, invisible yet essential. Chattel slaves were property, bought and sold in bustling agoras. State slaves kept public records and patrolled the streets. Domestic slaves cooked, cleaned, tutored, even advised. Ironically, some could earn money, gain skills, even buy freedom, but never escaped the brand society burned onto their backs. Philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, brilliant yet bound by their time, called slavery natural. They viewed some humans as tools with souls, born to serve those with higher intellect. It's a contradiction so striking, it echoes still. How can a society that invents equality so easily deny it? Sparta fear as foundation. If Athens masked slavery behind intellect, Sparta wore it like armor. Their enslaved class, the Helots, were not just laborers. They were conquered peoples kept in place through ritual terror. Spartans declared war on them yearly, a chilling tradition that allowed young soldiers to legally kill Helots as part of their training. The Helots worked the land, Spartans reaped the glory. Spartan strength was legendary, but it stood on the trembling shoulders of the oppressed. Every Spartan victory was fertilized with Helot blood. And yet, in silence, the Helots endured, planting seeds not just in fields, but in the memory of resistance. Finally, let's cross the Adriatic to ancient Rome, a republic turned empire whose appetite for conquest was matched only by its reliance on slavery. Here, slavery was not a side note. It was an institutional engine. By the 1st century BCE, Rome's population may have included over 2 million slaves, from African warriors to Celtic women, from Greek scholars to Carthaginian children. Rome didn't just enslave people, it branded entire cultures. Slaves built roads, temples, aqueducts. They farmed, fought, entertained, healed. Many lived and died with no name remembered, no tomb carved. But within the empire, paradoxes again emerged. Some slaves became wealthy merchants, buying their freedom and rising socially. Others led revolts, none more famous than Spartacus, the gladiator who nearly turned the empire on its head. His rebellion shook Rome. His execution alongside 6,000 crucified rebels lining the Appian Way was the empire's reply, merciless, unforgettable. We often admire the ruins of Greece and Rome, but rarely ask who dug the foundations. Yet beneath every law, every ode, every statue, lay the labor of the enslaved. Freedom was a birthright, but only if you were born right. From the Parthenon's builders to the gladiator's last breath, slavery in Greece. And Rome teaches us that progress and oppression often dance together in history's grand halls. And as we exit the ancient world, we carry forward a sobering realization. Civilization did not rise in spite of slavery. For centuries, it rose because of it. But history was about to shift. As empires faded and a man from Nazareth preached love and liberation, a new moral compass began to emerge. Would religion challenge slavery or entrench it deeper? As the marble columns of Rome cracked under the weight of corruption and its gladiator cries faded into ash, a quiet voice began echoing through the empire. It wasn't from palaces or senate halls, but from desert roads, prison cells, and humble fishermen. It was the voice of a new doctrine, one that preached love, forgiveness, and spiritual equality. But could this radical faith stand against the institution that chained millions? Let's find out. His message? That all are equal in the eyes of God. Jesus of Nazareth walked among the poor, touched lepers, and embraced outcasts. But here's the tension. The New Testament never directly condemns slavery. Why? Historians suggest two things. One, Jesus' focus was spiritual transformation, not political revolution. He used slaves in parables, not as condemnation, but as reflection of service and humility. His teachings laid the seed. But the tree of abolition wouldn't grow for centuries. Was Paul upholding slavery? Or was he trying to protect early Christians from harsher persecution, knowing the social order wasn't changing overnight? 2. His early followers were a persecuted minority. Speaking directly against Roman norms might have extinguished the movement early. Bishops, even popes, owned slaves. Monasteries used them. They spiritualized bondage. You may be chained on earth, but you are free in Christ. A comfort to the soul, yes, but cold comfort to the body still in chains. Centuries later, the duality of the Church's legacy on slavery is clear. Church law regulated their treatment, but didn't abolish the system. The term serf replaced slave. The reality? Not that different. That was rare. Shockingly rare. When Christianity became the official religion of Rome in 380 AD, everything changed. The Church often blessed this order. Divine hierarchy, they said. So instead, the Gospels show him elevating the enslaved spiritually. He washed feet, and yet they're complicated. They were chained in the name of progress and civilization. And Europe's thirst for sugar, gold, and glory fed the darkest trade in human history. What began as a limited slave trade quickly scaled into a monstrous system. By the end of the 19th century, Over 12.5 million Africans had crossed the Atlantic in chains. 12.5 million lives. That's not a statistic. That's a scar. Paul wrote a letter, Philemon, urging his master to receive Onesimus, no longer as a slave, but a beloved brother. Faith inspired rebellion. It also justified submission. But for millions of Africans, it became the age of disappearance. The contradiction? Africa provided human cargo, captured or sold into slavery. The Americas gave back sugar, cotton, coffee, and tobacco, grown by slave labor. Still burning, cramped, filthy, disease-ridden. People shackled together for up to 3 months. No fresh air, little food, no sanitation. That single letter, a historical bombshell. Millions died en route from dysentery, starvation, beatings, or suicide. Some were thrown overboard to save supplies, or because they were considered too sick to profit from. In Ephesians 6 verse 5, he wrote, "They were acts of defiance, of dignity, of determination." Yes, many of the institutions we admire today were built with blood money. Paul's letters shaped early Christianity. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear. Paul did something radical, though. He told slave owners and slaves alike that they were equal in Christ. Take Onesimus, a runaway slave. Because in it, Paul made clear, faith made men equal, even if law didn't. The church was no longer the voice of the oppressed. It had become part of the establishment. And with that came compromise. To some church fathers like Augustine, slavery was a consequence of sin, but not something to revolt against. Not all believers stayed silent. Gregory of Nyssa, a 4th century bishop, thundered, "You are condemning a man to slavery whose nature is free." Escaped slaves who formed independent settlements thrived in Jamaica, Brazil, and Suriname. Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1800, for the only successful slave revolt in history, leading to the first Black Republic. Still, scattered Christian sects, like the Waldensians and later the Quakers, planted seeds that would blossom into full-blown abolitionist movements. It offered hope to the enslaved, but for a long time, it didn't offer them freedom. As feudalism spread across medieval Europe, slavery didn't disappear, it evolved. Serfs were tied to the land, passed from lord to lord. They couldn't own property, travel freely, or refuse labor. But underground, songs were sung, prayers whispered, and movements stirred. And then came the sails, the ships, the conquest, the age of exploration. This ancient system of bondage and exploded across oceans. What happened when slavery met the New World? How did faith and greed reshape the globe? They called it the Age of Discovery. They vanished from villages, from markets, from families. This is the story of the Atlantic slave trade, a chapter not just in history books, but carved into the bones of nations. How it started, when Portugal turned west. In the mid-1400s, Portuguese explorers, backed by Prince Henry the Navigator, began sailing along the West African coast. At first, they traded beads, textiles, and metal goods for gold, ivory, and people. By 1502, the first enslaved Africans were shipped to the Americas. Let that number settle in. The Triangle of Terror, the Atlantic slave trade, wasn't random. It was a mechanized, brutal triangle. Europe sent weapons, alcohol, and manufactured goods to Africa. It was the most profitable trade route of its time. But at what cost? The Middle Passage, a floating hell. Imagine a dark ship. This was the Middle Passage, the journey from Africa to the Americas. Slave ships were called floating coffins because they often delivered corpses more than laborers. The economics of cruelty, but why did it happen? Because slavery paid. Sugar plantations in the Caribbean, cotton farms in the American South, silver mines in Brazil. All of it built on the backs of enslaved people. European cities like Liverpool, Lisbon, and Bordeaux grew rich. Families built empires. Banks, universities, even churches benefited. Resistance and rebellion, but the enslaved didn't remain silent. They fought back. Ship revolts, like on the Amistad, occurred during transit. These weren't just acts of survival. Religion, chains, or courage. European colonizers often used Christianity to justify slavery, citing verses like, "Slaves, obey your masters." But many enslaved Africans converted on their own terms. They fused Christian stories with African traditions, creating music, hope, and messages of resistance. Songs like Go Down, Moses weren't just spirituals. They were codes, a reminder deliverance would come, names we must remember. While history remembers slave owners and colonizers, we must also remember Olaudah Equiano, an enslaved man who bought his freedom and wrote one of the first abolitionist memoirs. Nzinga of Ndongo, a fierce African queen who resisted Portuguese slavers. Toussaint Louverture, the genius behind the Haitian Revolution. Their names deserve to echo louder than the names of slave traders. We've crossed oceans. What if I told you that in the same period, millions more were enslaved across the Islamic world, in the Middle East and North Africa? Let's not sugarcoat this. We've seen chains and rebellions. Now, let's look at the human cost. But slavery wasn't limited to the Atlantic. Entire African communities were emptied. This wasn't just history, it was a genocide masked as commerce. Still visible today in racial inequalities, generational trauma, and fractured identities. Generations were lost, families torn apart, cultures suppressed, and the effects? When we talk about slavery, most minds jump straight to the Atlantic trade. But what if I told you that another vast and ancient system of slavery existed? One that stretched from the Sahara Desert to India and from the Ottoman courts to the Persian Gulf? A system that lasted over 1,000 years, yet remains largely forgotten or ignored in mainstream history discussions. Let's step into the world of Islamic slavery, a deeply complex, often misunderstood system that shaped empires, cultures, and millions of lives. The Islamic world slave trade dates back to the 7th century, shortly after the rise of Islam. Unlike the Atlantic trade, it wasn't focused on just one race or region. Enslaved people were taken from Sub-Saharan Africa, Eastern Europe, especially Slavs, Central Asia, India, and Southeast Asia. Estimates suggest that over 17 million people were enslaved through Islamic trade routes. That's more than the transatlantic slave trade. Yet, why don't we talk about it? The Arab slave routes. The Arab slave trade followed key routes. Islamic slavery had unique elements. Across the Sahara, through Timbuktu and Kano, the Red Sea into Arabia, the Indian Ocean to Persia, India, and beyond. Many enslaved Africans were known as Zanj and were used in plantations, homes, and armies. One of the largest revolts in early Islamic history, the spiritual justifications often clashed with the realities of power, wealth, and empire. Slavery was embedded in Islamic empires. The Zanj Rebellion, 869 to 883 CE, a massive uprising of African slaves in southern Iraq. It shook the Abbasid Caliphate to its core. Slaves could sometimes earn freedom. Yes, even white Christians were enslaved by Muslim pirates off the coast of Morocco, Algeria, and Libya. Some became generals, poets, scholars, like Mamluks in Egypt or Ottoman eunuchs. Some argue that Islamic slavery was more humane. Others say this downplays the suffering. Truth is, both systems, whether in a plantation in Brazil or a palace in Baghdad, freedom was still stolen. One reason? Colonial narratives. Others were absorbed into families or converted. But let's be clear, slavery is still slavery. We rarely hear about them, but they existed. Modern political sensitivities in Islamic countries. Facing this history honestly requires courage from all sides. Because no civilization is innocent when it comes to slavery. Girls were taken as concubines. The once unquestioned institution of slavery, so deeply woven into the fabric of every empire and economy, began to face its first serious reckoning. The 18th century saw a quiet but powerful awakening, one not led by armies at first, but by pens, pulpits, and protests. In the name of faith, empire, or trade, it left no continent untouched. But what happened when the world finally began to awaken? Boys were castrated, especially in large numbers. Some estimate 70 to 90% mortality during castration. If the enslaved could rise up and win, what would stop others? In churches, abolitionists like William Wilberforce and Thomas Clarkson began stirring hearts with sermons and pamphlets. Women, workers, and even children lent their voices to a cause that had long been ignored. Former enslaved individuals like Olaudah Equiano wrote detailed accounts of their suffering, peeling back the polite lies that propped up the trade. It was a monumental step, but not the end. Slavery itself remained legal in British colonies until 1833. The enslaved weren't truly free, but the cracks in the system were widening. Slave ship diagrams circulated through London and Manchester, exposing the cramped, hellish conditions of the Middle Passage. These images weren't just informative, they were devastating. Chains may have been broken, but structures of oppression remained solidly in place, merely shifting shape. Yet, it came with a haunting asterisk. Forced labor was still legal as a punishment for crime. That single clause cracked open the door for the prison labor system, a rebranded form of servitude that disproportionately targeted Black Americans. Within years, former slaves, many with no land, no education, and no support, found themselves arrested under vague laws like vagrancy and leased out to corporations and plantation owners in a system eerily similar to the one they had just escaped. The fields still needed tending, the economy still demanded cheap labor, and society, unwilling to truly transform, clung to the very ideologies that had once justified slavery. After the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833, enslaved people were not instantly freed. They were apprenticed, required to work without pay for their former masters for years. The fields were soaked not only with sweat, but with the blood of those who dared to dream of true liberation. The transition left a massive population of Afro-Brazilians in the margins of society, systematically denied access to land, opportunity, and justice. Yet they carved spaces of culture and resistance, from capoeira to samba, turning pain into power. It was slavery by another name, dressed in politeness and policy. It wasn't handed down kindly by rulers with a change of heart. It was demanded, fought for. The cotton picked by enslaved hands funded banks still thriving today. They refused to accept the myth that history was something to be politely forgotten. The Harlem Renaissance exploded with Black brilliance. Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, and others poured soul and intellect into every page, every canvas, every stage. Black identity was no longer something to be hidden or suppressed. It was power. Colonial borders carved by outsiders had divided ethnic groups and rewritten ancient histories. But voices began to rise there too. Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, Nelson Mandela in South Africa. Their missions were not just political, they were deeply personal. They were the echo of ancestors who had been stolen, sold, and silenced. Instead, they reclaimed it. From W.E.B. Du Bois to Ida B. The descendants of enslaved Africans were demanding not just independence from European powers, but recognition of their own stories, stories written not by empire, but by endurance. Figures like Marcus Garvey ignited Pan-African consciousness, calling for unity and pride in heritage long buried by shame and silence. In Trinidad, Jamaica, Haiti, and beyond, art, music, and politics became battlegrounds for memory and liberation. Wells, intellectuals and activists began dismantling the narrative that slavery had been an unfortunate but necessary past. They replaced it with truth, raw, painful, liberating truth. Jim Crow laws still loomed, segregation still thrived, and lynching still claimed lives, but so did defiance. The racial caste systems born in the colonies found new life in housing policies, job markets, and criminal justice systems, earned through struggle, blood, and relentless resistance. In places like Rosewood, Florida, and Greenwood in Tulsa, Oklahoma, Black excellence blossomed until it was met with violence. For centuries, the trauma of slavery had rippled beneath society's surface like a suppressed storm. But now, that storm was beginning to speak. Through movements, through voices, through fearless resistance that refused to be silenced. Lynchings became a grotesque public spectacle, a cruel reminder that white supremacy had not died with slavery. And yet, the spirit of resistance never faded. It whispered through spirituals, marched in protest lines, and echoed through generations who refused to be erased. From revolts on plantations to fiery debates in legislative halls, the end of slavery came because people, free and enslaved alike, refused to accept it any longer. They brought the cruelty of slavery into the drawing rooms of the privileged and the sanctuaries of the devout. From Brazil to Jamaica, planters and politicians watched with clenched fists, knowing their world order was now at risk. Africans were often racially marginalized despite Islamic principles of equality. Thinkers like John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau started to plant seeds that would eventually bloom into revolution. all men are created equal, proclaimed the Declaration of Independence in 1776. Yet this bold claim echoed through a society that still held thousands in bondage. The question remained, could true freedom be achieved in a world that had built its wealth and identity on centuries of bondage? That rage would erupt in 1791 in what would become the most successful slave revolt in history, the Haitian Revolution. It began with torches and machetes in the cane fields of Saint-Domingue and ended with the birth of the first Black Republic in 1804. Led by figures like Toussaint Louverture and Jean-Jacques Dessalines, the enslaved population of Haiti not only overthrew their French masters, but rewrote the rules of revolution itself. Enslaved Africans heard those words, too, and many began to wonder, if liberty is worth dying for, does that not include them? Though many of these men were not entirely free of contradiction, some owned slaves or remained complicit. The ideas they put forth would come to haunt the very systems that benefited from slavery. The Ottomans, Mughals, and North Africa. The Ottoman Empire ran slave markets in Istanbul and Cairo. Mamluks, originally slave soldiers, ruled Egypt for centuries. North African Barbary states captured over 1 million Europeans in coastal raids. That's a twist few history books explore. Was it better than Atlantic slavery? This debate stirs controversy. Stripped people of freedom, sold them as property, used religion, race, or war to justify the trade. European scholars emphasized African slavery under Islam to deflect blame for their own crimes. Another reason? Forgotten lives, forgotten names. African bodyguards who guarded Mughal emperors. Eunuchs who held power in Ottoman harems. Zanj rebels who fought for dignity in the marshes of Basra. They lived, they suffered, they resisted. They deserve remembrance. Slavery wasn't confined to ships crossing the Atlantic. It flowed across deserts, oceans, and dynasties. As the world crept toward the Enlightenment, something began to shift, not just in the minds of philosophers and kings, but in the very conscience of humanity. In Europe, intellectual circles sparked by the Enlightenment began to ask dangerous questions. What does it mean to be human? Is liberty truly a universal right? Across the Atlantic, the American Revolution thundered with cries of freedom and self-determination. In the Caribbean, the hypocrisy was even more volatile. Sugar plantations fueled the wealth of European empires, but beneath the surface simmered rage. Haiti was a terrifying precedent for colonial powers. Meanwhile, in Britain, a different kind of resistance was building. And then came the petitions, thousands of signatures collected from across Britain, calling on Parliament to act. This wasn't just an elite movement. It was grassroots. It was during this swell of moral awakening that the British Parliament passed the Slave Trade Act of 1807, banning the transatlantic slave trade. It's important to remember that abolition was never a gift. And even as laws were passed and chains were broken, the ghost of slavery lingered. Freedom had finally been declared, but what did it truly mean? For millions of formerly enslaved people across the Americas, emancipation arrived not with celebration and clarity, but with uncertainty and betrayal. In the United States, the abolition of slavery in 1865 through the 13th Amendment was hailed as a national triumph. This was not freedom, it was transformation. From the auction block to the courtroom, from overseers to sheriffs, the chains were now made of laws and systems instead of iron. And yet, in the middle of this betrayal, people resisted. Communities of freedmen and women began building schools, founding churches, and forming self-sufficient enclaves. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, in British colonies like Jamaica, Trinidad, and Barbados, abolition came wrapped in hypocrisy. But even there, resistance was unyielding. From Nanny of the Maroons to Paul Bogle, Caribbean freedom fighters rose, defying empires and demanding dignity. And in South America, Brazil, the last country in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery in 1888, grappled with its own deep scars. Even in freedom, the enslaved were expected to forget, to move on, to be grateful. But history is not so easily erased. This is the haunting truth. Slavery may have ended on paper, but its echoes are stitched into modern economies, politics, and societal structures. And so, we are left with a question, perhaps the most important of all: if a system ends, but its consequences are left unchecked, has it truly ended at all? The 20th century dawned with thunder, lest the crash of cannon fire and more the quiet rumble of awakening minds across continents. In the Americas, particularly in the United States, the children and grandchildren of enslaved people began to rise. Across the South, churches became fortresses of hope. Spirituals, once sung in cotton fields as veiled codes of escape, evolved into gospel anthems of survival. Meanwhile, in the Caribbean, waves of decolonization began to swell. And in Africa itself, the wounds of the transatlantic slave trade were far from healed. Fast forward through the ages to the rise of empires. As the Roman Empire expanded, so did its thirst for conquest, wealth, and power. Slaves captured during military campaigns were brought to Rome, becoming integral to its grand design. They labored in homes, on plantations, and in mines, fueling the engine of the Roman way of life. Stripped of their names, identities, and subjected to inhumane treatment, they were forced into labor, enduring relentless workdays on plantations cultivating cash crops like sugar, tobacco, and cotton. Figures like Frederick Douglass captivated audiences with his powerful narratives of escape and resistance. Groups like the Underground Railroad, a clandestine network of activists, aided enslaved people in escaping to freedom. This bloody conflict pitted the Union, led by President Abraham Lincoln, against the Confederacy, led by Jefferson Davis, officially ending this dark chapter in American history. However, the struggle for true freedom and equality was far from over. At its core, the war was a battle over slavery. On January 1, 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, a historic document declaring the freedom of enslaved people in Confederate states. Ordinary citizens, moved by the plight of African Americans, joined the movement, marching, protesting, and demanding change. These acts of solidarity, though sometimes met with violence, were crucial in shifting public opinion and laying the groundwork for future progress. While it didn't immediately end slavery, it marked a turning point in the fight for emancipation. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. championed nonviolent resistance, inspiring boycotts, sit-ins, and peaceful protests. It attracted national and international attention. Descendants of enslaved people and activists worldwide have demanded apologies, reparations, and acknowledgement of the profound impact of slavery on their communities. They argue that acknowledging this history is essential for healing and creating a more equitable future. Malcolm X, a prominent figure in the Nation of Islam, advocated for Black empowerment and self-defense, challenging the nonviolent approach of some of his contemporaries. There are signs that the world is beginning to confront its history more honestly. The story of slavery serves as a haunting reminder of humanity's capacity for both great achievements and unspeakable cruelty. It compels us to examine our shared history, understand the roots of inequality, and strive to create a future where justice, equality, and respect for human dignity prevail. His fiery rhetoric and calls for Black pride resonated with many who felt disillusioned by the pace of change. Feel free to share your thoughts, stories, or questions in the comments below. Your engagement helps us craft more insightful journeys through history. If you enjoyed this episode, hit that like button and subscribe to ensure you never miss an upload. And if you'd like to support us further, consider becoming a patron where you can access exclusive content and influence our future episodes. Thank you for joining me on this enlightening journey through history. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring the world around you. The March on Washington in 1963, where King delivered his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech, was a pivotal moment. It highlighted the urgency for racial equality and served as a catalyst for change. The Montgomery bus boycott, sparked by Rosa Parks' refusal to give up her seat on a segregated bus, demonstrated the power of collective action. The sit-in movement, where students peacefully protested segregation and lunch counters, challenged Jim Crow laws head-on. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, or national origin, dismantling legal barriers that had long confined African Americans. Despite legislative progress, systemic racism and implicit biases persist. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, another monumental achievement, aimed to overcome the remaining obstacles to Black voting rights, ensuring that all citizens could exercise their right to vote. Harriet Tubman, a conductor on the Underground Railroad, risked her life repeatedly, guiding hundreds of slaves to liberty. Her bravery and determination made her a legend in the fight against slavery. Despite legal emancipation, they were confronted with limited access to education, healthcare, economic opportunities, and civil rights. Segregation, Jim Crow laws, and racial violence became prevalent. It was a disheartening reality that contradicted the ideals of equality and justice. Born into slavery in Maryland, Douglass escaped to freedom and dedicated his life to abolishing slavery. His autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, became a beacon of hope and inspired generations to fight for equality. Their labor fueled the economic engine of the Americas and laid the foundation for vast fortunes. Leaders like Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois emerged, advocating for equal rights and opportunities. Washington, known for his pragmatic approach, emphasized vocational training and economic self-sufficiency as paths to progress. Du Bois, a proponent of the talented 10th, believed that the most educated members of the African American community should lead the fight for civil rights. Meanwhile, in the Byzantine Empire, slavery continued its grip, particularly among the ruling class. China had undergone significant transformations with the emergence of the Qing dynasty. The ruling Manchu nobility implemented policies that profoundly impacted the lives of ordinary citizens. One of the most notorious was the opium trade. British merchants, eager to find a market for their excess opium, targeted China, leading to widespread addiction and social upheaval. The Chinese government's attempts to curb opium use led to conflicts, including the Opium Wars, which resulted in further humiliation and forced trade concessions. Slaves were seen as possessions, highlighting the stark realities of this era. Across the sea, in the heart of Africa, a different story unfolds. During this period, many African societies were flourishing. They had rich cultures, complex social structures, and a deep connection to their land. As European powers grew bolder, they set their sights on Africa, initiating a brutal process known as colonization. They exploited resources, subjugated populations, and initiated a horrifying enterprise, the transatlantic slave trade. Millions of Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic Ocean, enduring unimaginable cruelty and suffering on crowded ships packed into the infamous holds of vessels like the Mayflower and later, slave ships. It was a harrowing journey marked by death, despair, and a profound disregard for human life. Slavery existed, but it was vastly different from the chattel slavery that would later define the Atlantic slave trade. Enslaved people in Africa were often able to maintain aspects of their cultural identity and sometimes even held considerable rights compared to their counterparts in the Americas and Europe. And then came a horrific twist in the tale. Upon arrival in the New World, enslaved Africans were bought and sold. Meanwhile, in Asia, the story takes another dark turn. However, amidst these struggles, heroes emerged. As the 19th century progressed, the abolitionist movement gained momentum. Then came the pivotal moment when the American Civil War erupted. As the war raged on, the Union ultimately triumphed. And in 1865, the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution abolished slavery. In the aftermath of slavery, African Americans faced a daunting reality. Despite these challenges, the African American community exhibited remarkable resilience. But the quest for justice didn't remain confined to the courts and legislative halls. It resonated with people from all walks of life. The mid-20th century witnessed a surge in activism. As the civil rights movement gained momentum, amidst this struggle, other voices also rose to prominence. Gradually, significant legislative victories were achieved. However, it is essential to recognize that the fight for racial justice and equality is not a destination, but a continuous journey. In recent years, a growing movement has sought to confront the legacies of slavery and colonialism directly. From museums restituting stolen artifacts to universities acknowledging their ties to slavery. As we stand on the threshold of a new era, what struck you the most about this journey through the history of slavery?